All right. Hopefully we've got everybody logged in from the waiting room. So welcome everybody to another one of the ACAPS webinars, trying to help focus this year's match and provide some advice and suggestions. This session is focused on the personal statement, and there's a number of faculty that are involved. I'm Jeff Kozlow. Deborah Becker is here from Pittsburgh. Marissa Tenenbaum will likely be joining us from WashU in St. Louis. We have Tony Smith from Mayo, Arizona, who's also the immediate past president of ACAPS, and then Michael Harrington, who's joining us from South Florida. So everyone here is going to contribute to some of the discussion, and then please use the chat function if you have questions. We will do our best to try to get to them as we get through this, or if not, we'll get them at the end. So just a couple of quick disclosures. For myself, I do have a licensing agreement with Baxter and Synovus for a microsurgical instrument that doesn't have any relevance to today's topics. But I think more importantly is all 5 of us work extensively with medical students as career advisors. This is true both in plastic surgery as well as many of us mentor students in other fields. So we have a fair amount of experience in this area and have read a lot of personal statements. But this is also all of our own personal opinions and experiences. We admittedly all have our biases of the things that we like and don't like in personal statements. And so we'll have probably some healthy debate on some of the topics as we go through. And I think it'll be critical that you recognize that we're only giving you our views, and that your personal statements are going to be read by probably hundreds of people this upcoming fall. So just a very quick introduction before we get to the meat of everything. One of the common things about the personal statement is that it's neither personal nor a statement. And when you're writing this, you'll see kind of what that means. It is different than your medical school personal statement. And while you can go back and look at your medical school personal statement to get some ideas, you may also look back at it and say, ugh, I can't believe that's what I wrote about myself. But it is different. You're applying for a different type of position, a different role. In a way, residency is a job, it's not school, and so some of the goals may be a little bit different. You also are, most of us were a little more mature when we were applying for residencies compared to when we were applying for medical school. And it's going to be read by many, many people, and so I think you need to consider a very broad audience and recognize that what might suit one person may not suit a whole group of others. And I think this is, again, this may be a little bit of my bias on it, but I don't think anybody's ever been awarded or granted an interview or residency spot based only on their personal statement. And while it can be attractive to someone and it may entice them to read further into your application, just because you have a strong personal statement doesn't necessarily mean that that's the only thing that's going to matter in your application. And I think it's also important to realize that a number of people have probably missed opportunities to interview because of their personal statement. And this goes back to kind of it's neither personal nor a statement, but there are some things that I think if written and read will give people a reason to potentially put your application down a little bit quicker than you want and to not necessarily read through everything in the same detail that you've already prepared. So I think it's a little bit of a double-edged sword. To show you the importance, though, of the personal statement, this is a survey. This is from 2012, although the data is not much different than now. Just in this question, they asked program directors, and this is in plastic surgery, to share the importance of each of these factors in terms of granting interviews. So this is kind of the first phase. And you'll see that the personal statement was actually seen as important by 88% of program directors, really pretty high right after letters of recommendation. And so people do pay attention to this. If you then look later on in terms of what's the importance when ranking applicants, you'll see that it falls down the list. And I think that's true in the past, in part because you, instead of having a written statement, you were going to be evaluated and interviewed over a 24-hour period. We'll see. I think this year, potentially, the personal statement might have a little more weight, especially because interviews are probably going to be a little bit more limited in fashion. I obviously don't have the exact information on it, but I think it's important to consider that this year might be slightly different. So just a couple of basic tips to start. One, I think it's important to start early, and although your application is not due for another couple of months, it's something to start now. This is not a project to cram for the day that ERAS is due. You want to start this, put your thoughts down, set it aside, come back and read it again, and you want to share it with a number of people. You really want to consider your message and pick the couple of qualities that you really want to share or express. I would show multiple surgeons, and I think preferably plastic surgeons for feedback. While it's important to show this to your friends and your parents and others, you really want to know how the people that are going to be evaluating your application packet are going to interpret or feel about your personal statement. So I think it is critical to have a number of people to read this. And while you can still get some good advice from your family medicine physician or a research mentor, realize that they may have different preferences and they may have different things that they're looking for in their specialty compared to what surgeons and specifically plastic surgeons might be looking for. I do think you need to read through this and imagine that you're an immature teenager reading your personal statement to make sure there's nothing that you would laugh at. We used to reference the old MTV cartoon Beavis and Butthead, but I'm not sure that your generation fully remembers that show. But if there are things that you think a teenager would get a laugh out of when they read it, chances are there's probably someone else that's going to see it as immature, and so keep that in mind. Make sure that there's no grammar or spelling errors. They're just simply unacceptable. And then don't get discouraged. This is really tough. Writing about yourself is not easy. Writing about it in this context of trying to apply for plastic surgery residency is not easy. And so if you're having a tough day doing it, set it aside. Come back another day and work on it again. And again, for most students, really the goal is to make it not memorable. And again, this year may be a little bit different, given that we're going to probably be focusing, I think, more on the packet, even when we're looking at the decision of who to rank. But again, for most folks, it is tough to distinguish yourself completely from your personal statement. That doesn't mean you can't use it to highlight the things that are important in your application and to draw attention to those. That it's a very useful tool for. And so, this is just me, but what do I like? I want to know who you are professionally. I want to know what you're going to be like as a plastic surgeon, what you're going to be like as a plastic surgery trainee. If I'm working with you for 6 years, I want to know why you want to be a plastic surgeon. And I want to know what you've accomplished. And I think for kind of those personal qualities, it's important to show, not just tell. If you're going to say that you have, one of your strengths is empathy, then you need to give an example of that or demonstrate that and let me infer that you're empathetic. Or, if you're really creative or a really good team player, instead of just saying, I'm a team player, really give an example of it. You need to highlight the activities that are really important. The ERAS application ends up being 40 pages. It is tough to sometimes pick out what's most important, and so you can use your personal statement to highlight that one or two experiences that are of most value. And then you do not need to recite your entire CV. And I think then talk about why you're going to make a difference in plastic surgery. But again, these are just kind of my personal preferences, and everyone will have a little bit of different opinion on it. And I think finally, it's always important to share how you're going to be a good, dedicated, hardworking resident. And then the final thing before we get into kind of the next part of this is you can use your personal statement to address deficiencies, especially if you're an applicant that potentially has something that needs to be explained. This includes poor test scores, academic issues, extended time away, or some specific hardship that may have impacted your educational experience and be reflected in your application. And so this is a good time to give an explanation for those things so that people understand what actually happened and they don't infer or try to guess what the situation was. And I think most importantly, you have to be positive. You want people to read this and to think highly of you. And so make sure all of your phrases are positive in terms of talking about yourself. So with that, I put this together, some ideas with the ideas of the rest of the panelists. And I comment on these because these are 11 common ideas or themes that we often see in personal statements, but they may be less powerful than you plan. And I say that in the context of when we read through 200 personal statements, there's some themes that we tend to read a lot. And while these may be very powerful for you, or you may assume or think that they're powerful to the reader, just think a little bit twice about it, or think about how you're going to word it. Because it may not have the same impact that you think it has. So My first one is philosophical quotes. Tony, I'm gonna kind of bounce around our panelists here, but I don't know what your thoughts are on philosophical quotes within a personal statement, if there's something that you're attracted to or not attracted to. You got to come off mute.
So I think it's like anything else, it all depends, right? So obviously when people put quotes, they either put them at the beginning or put them at the end. I think that there was a time that quotes were a novelty, but I think now they have perhaps maybe become less of a novelty. I would say that, you know, again, I think that you really said it very well. There's going to be some biases. I think if somebody has a well thought out quote that kind of picks my interest right at the very beginning or right at the end, I would say I see it as a plus. I mean, I think that, but I think at the same point in time, you know, I think that the source of the quote, you know, has to kind of be in line with what we're looking for. You know, something that perhaps expresses a character attribute, right? Because in reality, one of the things we're trying to decide is what's the character of the applicant. So I think if the quote somehow shows a certain character attribute that's admirable in a plastic surgery applicant, it's a good quote. If it's, you know, something less than that or obtuse, then I'd say leave it out. Because I think, you know, the one thing that you didn't mention, which you probably will, that in reality, you know, it's people have to look out a lot of these personal statements. Brevity is a good thing. Get to the point. Ernest Hemingway, short declarative sentences. So, and I'll do that when I give my talk. I'll talk a little bit more about that.
Great. Marissa, do you have some thoughts on quotes in personal statements?
I think I probably can't really say it any better than what you and Tony just said. I think that if you want to use a quote to help illustrate your point or to tell a story, I think that's okay, but it really just, it needs to make sense. It needs to make sense in the greater context of the message you're trying to deliver in your personal statement, rather than, I think Tony used the word obtuse. I think that's perfect. You don't want to come across as quirky necessarily on your personal statement. So if you feel it really helps drive home a point and kind of wraps up a story for you, then I think it's okay. But I would agree with Jeff that it's probably less powerful than you think.
So my other one is a never-ending list of what plastic surgery is. I have a bias. I mean, we read a lot of personal statements where a whole paragraph talks about the beauty of a breast reconstruction, the elegance of a cleft lip, the difficulty of a pressure sore, the complexity of the hand, the mechanics of bone, craniofacial bone, and spends a paragraph talking about plastic surgery and not you. But Michael, what are your thoughts here?
This slide and then your next slide are two of my pet peeves in personal statements. And I'm not sure if we'll talk about this more, but you know, when I read a personal statement, I want to know about the person, you know, what makes them tick, what gets them up in the morning. And it's hard for me to believe that a person that's been alive for 20, 30 years is just so enamored with a case or something that happened that they saw in the operating room that has completely changed the way that they think and the way they do things, and that's why they want to do plastic surgery. So I could talk a little bit more on the next slide, but I totally agree with what you're saying, that this is this is something that I think is just it can be very verbose, and it's really a waste of a paragraph that really says nothing about the applicant.
So I'll leave it with you on this one then too, since you like the next slide, and then I'll go to Deborah next. But extensive patient stories.
Once again, another one of my pet peeves. I mean, when you start a personal statement with, you know, the lights are beating down and this patient with a cleft lip did not know the magnificent transformation they would have after the hands of the surgeon. I mean, these are, once again, these are just very verbose, and they don't really say anything about the applicant. And then, like I said, once again, it really doesn't say anything, doesn't tell me about the person. When I read personal statements, I want to know about the applicant. I want to know what has gotten them to this point in their life, what gets them up in the morning, what drives them to be what they are. And from there, then you can infer why they want to become a plastic surgeon. But putting extensive patient stories in a personal statement, I really think does nothing to the personal statement itself, other than just take up space that they could use to really highlight some of the other things that you mentioned earlier on in your presentation.
So Devra, for many of us, myself included, it was one patient that maybe really generated our interest in plastic surgery. That's, we all have that one case where we finally, I think, felt like this is what we want to do. So how do you encourage, or how do you discuss that in a personal statement without taking up too much space, or what do you think?
I was just going to say, you can do it, but it has to be with brevity. So the key point that you want to bring home is quickly how a patient affected you, and then how that influenced your decision to go into plastics. The other pitfall, I think, with extensive patient stories that I trip on a little is overclaiming your role in the case. We'll read personal statements where the student who's applying to plastics says, when I mapped out the surgical plan for, the complex craniofacial reconstruction, we all kind of know that isn't really the usual role of students. So when you are talking about patient stories, be very honest about what your role actually was on the team, if you're going to talk about that. And the other thing is just make it really quick, because what people really want to know about in the personal statement is you, and it shouldn't take more than one sentence to get across you saw a patient who had an impact on you for the following reasons. And that keeps the focus on.
I would also add, and this may seem obvious, but obviously you need to be cautious of HIPAA. And, I think you're best, if you are going to talk about a patient, you don't even need to necessarily try to use initials. You don't need to say John, parentheses, not their real name. If you are going to talk about the example, just talk about the situation briefly, but don't waste that space that you should be using to talk about yourself. Personal or family medical histories. Tony, what are your thoughts when you read personal statements that talk about either personal or family medical histories?
Well, again, it depends, right? So I think that I guess it depends how close the family member is. And if you can express it in a way that doesn't seem to be over embellished. If it's a close family member and you can express it and it seems genuine and it had an impact on you, and you leave it at that in perhaps 3 sentences, then I would say it's probably okay. If, on the other hand, this was a distant relative that you hadn't seen in 20 years and they had something bad happen to them and that changed your life, and you go on and on and on and refer back to it again, no. So I think, again, brevity, I think closeness of the relationship, how exactly it affected you, and how did you go forward from the event in your life.
Marissa?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think, you hit the nail on the head. I think if it, a lot of us do have that story of, okay, this really had an effect on me, and it made me, maybe it just made you realize how cool plastic surgery was. I think that's the story to leave out. I think if there is something you can really relate, again, I think there's a theme here. You have to be able to relate it to yourself and relate to the readers of your personal statement why and how that is going to make you a strong, hardworking, effective resident for them in their program, and then ultimately a contributor in plastic surgery. So really, when you're thinking about your personal statement, that should be the theme throughout. So if you have some kind of an experience with a patient or with a family member that allows you to illustrate that point in a concise way, then I think it's okay. But if it doesn't, then leave it out.
Marissa, I'm going to stick with you on a little bit of a tougher question. What about personal medical problems? Obviously, a number of people have had their own health challenges, and it's a little different than a family member that you watch go through something.
Yeah, I think that is a really good point. And again, any sort of personal strife or challenge or journey that you have, whether it's medical or whether it's something else, I think if you really learned from that and you grew from that, and there are aspects of that really impacted you in such a way that, again, it's going to translate to you being a really fantastic doctor, fantastic surgeon, hardworking resident, then I think you have to put it into that context. If it's simply to say, I was born with a certain congenital heart defect, and my parents had to endure lots of surgeries while I was little, but like it didn't, you were an infant and maybe it really had no bearing on kind of later in life for you, I'm not sure how you really tie that in. But if it's something that you really struggled with and grew and developed characteristics that are going to lead to you being an amazing surgeon, then I think that's awesome and it's great and it's something we want to know. I mean, to me, one of the biggest things that I try to look at in the application are some of those qualities, like team player, hardworking, motivated, forward thinking, etc. And you mentioned before, if you can highlight some of those things in your CV so that you don't have to dig through it in your personal statement, great. But then this would be something that isn't necessarily in your CV, and so it may be your opportunity to be able to navigate. And on the other side of it, whatever you want to use to drive on that point, then I think it can actually be a good story. But let other people read that.
Michael and Deborah, I don't know if either of you have thoughts on this. I'm going to stay on it just to make sure everyone has their ability to share their thoughts, because obviously your own personal medical history isn't a question that you should be asked about during the interview season. That's against all the global rules of the match. That obviously becomes different when the personal statement includes a paragraph about something and how that's impacted your training up to this point. Do either of you have thoughts on that?
I think the trick with the personal or family medical history is getting the tone neutral. One of the issues with bringing up personal medical teams into Saints, that the medical team was so awesome and so wonderful all of the time, and then the readers may read that and think, okay, well, maybe this person has unrealistic expectations about what it's really going to be like, because the reality is we're not perfect all the time. Or on the other hand, it comes from a place of, I had such a horrible experience, I want to make it better. And again, a reader may interpret that in a way that, okay, well, here's somebody who's coming in already with preconceived notions about how we are and how we should be. And that may influence the way that they think that you are going to function in the team or as a hard worker. And so that's what I think that the real risk is. The real risk is what people read into a tone and what people read into the story. And that's why it's such a careful thing. So it can be tricky. If it's very important in shaping your decision, it can be very powerful, but on the other hand, it can also be a liability if it's presented in a way that will make people question whether or not you're going to be.
Great. So humor. Michael, what are your thoughts on when you see humor in the personal statement?
Well, I guess it depends on if I think it's funny or not. This is something I always tell my applicants to kind of steer away from, because what I think is funny may not be what some of the other people reading the personal statements think is funny. So, you know, unless there is a story that has some humor in it, that once again is one of the reasons that shaped you to the person you are today, I think that putting jokes in, it can just be it could be detrimental to the personal statement, just because, like I said, you know, Tony's a great guy. We've hung out before, but you know, we may not think the same things are as funny as other people do. So I would probably steer away from putting in humor.
It's a little bit ironic that in a webinar, it's also tough to tell if your humor and your memes are actually funny or not, since you don't get to watch the audience. So other thoughts from the panelists on when they see on humor and personal statements? Like it, don't like it? Tony, what are your thoughts?
Well, it's interesting. I'm doing this from home, and many times I've actually sat and about to go into a podium, and my wife is next to me, and I'll have a joke in my presentation, and she invariably says, "That is so corny. Don't you do it." I think it's humor has risk, you know, and you're not a stand-up comedian. You're somebody that when they read that, they may have had the worst day ever. And so I think humor has a tremendous amount of risk. And like I said, you know, Michael and I are friends. We laugh at the same people and the same situations, but I would say leave it out.
All right. So, and this is a creepy picture, I admit, but being good with your hands. Marissa, what are your thoughts on the personal statements about, you know, being gifted with your hands as a carpenter or other mechanical?
Yeah, I think I would steer away from that a bit. I mean, I think if you have a hobby that is physical in such a way, I think that's okay to mention it, but I would actually mention it in a different way. I apologize. I'm in the car driving and there's like horrible sun on my face. I'm trying my best. So what I'm trying to get from the personal statement is sort of your commitment. So if you have a hobby or an activity that I would use that to talk more about your commitment to something rather than talking about how you're good with your hands or you're an amazing artist. Instead, I might hope that perhaps some of my letter writers talk more about my technical ability in the operating room rather than try to get that across myself in a personal statement. I think that that's kind of risky. And so I would use any sort of personal hobbies or sports, or, you know, you were a professional musician or whatever it is, I would use that less to tell us about your physical prowess with your hands and more about your dedication to something, your commitment to something, your ability to set goals and follow through.
You know, Sam, and I put this on here because I think a lot of our training programs recognize that it's really 6 years of surgical training, at least in, you know, the integrated, and that's where we're teaching you how to operate. And you know, as a student, it's tricky. Yes, there are some people that pick it up a little bit faster, but it's I can't say that there's a letter of recommendation that says this is the best student I've worked with technically. That I personally put a ton of weight in that, because I think that that's just tough to evaluate in most situations. But you mentioned number 7, which is being an artist, and we see this a lot as well. Deborah, what are your kind of thoughts along the ability to use your hands or to be an artist?
I think that applicants tend to think that it is important to us that they are artists, but being an artist does not translate into being a plastic surgeon. So the skills that you need to paint a picture or even make a sculpture are very different than the skills that you need to repair a fracture. And when you think about it, for example, we have hand as a subspecialty, and so does ortho. But I don't think that orthopedic surgeons apply saying that they're artists. So I think that it's nice to have a talent and have a skill. But again, if you're going to mention it, it's important to tie it into how that factors into your personality characteristics that will allow us to train you, rather than to make the connection, I am an artist, therefore plastic surgery has artistry to it.
So, you know, Michael, we have a ton of applicants who really are artistically talented, and, you know, have done artwork. How do they share that? What do you think? I mean, we've seen everything from students that carry portfolios that happen to, you know, carry it in their briefcase to all of a sudden it pops up on the phone. What's the best way to share that, do you think, if it's something that you think someone might be interested in, or how do you go about that? What are your thoughts?
I think I tell, once again, when I talk to my applicants about how they want to put themselves on their application, there is a, I believe it's extracurriculars, activities, and hobbies. And I've seen this in the past. I'm sure all the panelists have seen this in the past, where if they are an artist or they're a musician, you know, it gets kind of lost in the personal statement or other things. But if they even put a link to a portfolio, it can, you know, pique the interest of whoever is looking through the application, because the vast majority of the applications look very similar. But if there's a link on the extracurricular activities or hobbies, I know I'm going to click on it. And there was an applicant last year who was an incredible pianist that got an interview with me because it was just an incredible pianist. I've seen a lot of artists out there that really displayed their works. And so I think that if I were an artist, or I had a special talent, making a separate website where you can display this stuff so everyone can see it during the application process, and then also bringing some of your work with you to the interview itself, I think would be a great way to do it.
So it's interesting. So, you know, one of my pet peeves is when people all of a sudden pop out of their coat pocket or their portfolio a piece of art or a Rubik's Cube that they can show how they can solve, and it's kind of like a setup. So interesting, some dissenting opinions. So, Tony, you get, I won't call it the deciding vote, but what are your thoughts on when, you know, students bring in kind of the artwork or something else as a component of their interview? Obviously this should be a little different because it's online, but I'm sure, you know, you can still figure out ways to do it if you want. What are your thoughts?
Well, I've got to share one really bad anecdote. So we had a young man who was an entrepreneur, and he was doing clothing products. And out of his briefcase, he pulled his breathable underwear that he was selling. So I think, you know, to me, you know, I think that I have, you know, one of my really good friends is Sumit Teosha, who's at Southwestern. He was a general surgery resident with us. He illustrated a few of my publications. And I think, you know, if a student could come in and they, you know, they had, you know, illustrated some publications, like I know when Sumit, I mean, when he applied, I mean, he had medical illustrations in his portfolio. So I think, to me, if it gets to that point where it's starting to have some merit, maybe even some scientific merit, great. If on the other hand, it's your picture of a horse, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, and I would just to kind of be a little bit of a devil's advocate here, you know, as Deborah mentioned, being artistic, although it's certainly something to be so proud of and amazing, it doesn't necessarily correlate with being a good plastic surgeon. So for example, if you were a Division I athlete, which I find extremely impressive, shows me that you are a hard worker. It shows me you know how to balance, you know, schoolwork with, you know, something that takes an incredible amount of time and energy, et cetera, et cetera. I certainly would not expect you to pull out your highlight reel either. So, I'm not sure that I necessarily, not that I wouldn't enjoy looking at those pictures, but I think trying to illustrate the level that you obtained in something is really important because it shows us your dedication. But I don't know that we necessarily need to see, an artistic portfolio, a highlight reel from, your college football days or, your baton twirling days or whatever it is. Just try to illustrate to us your level of dedication, your commitment, kind of how you were rewarded for those commitments, et cetera. I think that's more important than maybe the actual work, visibly seeing the actual work.
Okay, great. So number 8, overconfidence. Deborah, do you have an example of some overconfidence that you saw potentially in a personal statement?
Was that for me?
Yes.
Oh, sorry. So yeah, again, for me, I don't know what the examples you had, but for me, a lot of the overconfidence is just really overstating your involvement in things. If you worked in a lab and were involved in a major project, again, it's great. You don't have to say that, you designed the project or it was your personal project if you were part of a team. And again, it kind of goes back to just being honest about what your actual roles were in things. I think another thing that goes really far in applications is a little bit of humility. I mean, residency and medicine is humbling all the time, no matter what level you're at. And so you will have humbling experiences during residency. And putting something in the application that shows that you have the humility to learn from them and grow from them, that.
We kind of lost you there, Deborah. Your last comment.
Yeah, I muted myself. So the way to present yourself as confident, I think, in the personal statement is to demonstrate that you have humility, ironically, just because medicine and residency are humbling. And what we need to know in an applicant is that they can take a failure and learn from it and grow from it. I don't need to know that you're great already.
There's one of the personal statements that sticks out, and this is from years ago, was someone had an interesting hobby, and there was a funny name to it, and but let's just say I'm a bluesmith, and it said, you want to know what a bluesmith is, then you better interview me. And it gave kind of a really negative impression to it. I think it's that kind of a little bit of overconfidence of things. So distant past accomplishments. Michael, what are your thoughts on how far back are accomplishments maybe not as relevant?
I think this goes back to even one of the first things Tony says. I guess it kind of depends. It just depends on if that is something that has really shaped you. But going back to the Double Dare days that you have up here, that may be a little bit too far. But if it's something in high school, once again, seeing that cool plastic surgery case, or playing a team sport, or doing something that's kind of driven you to the point that you are at today, I think is relevant. But once again, it's my personal bias with this is that it has to be something that's really shaped you as a person to get you to this point in your life.
Tony, how far back do you think? Is high school, things that happen in high school, relevant, college, just focusing on medical school?
Well, so it's interesting. So I think that's a really good point, because we actually had an applicant this past year that got some really bad advice. And she asked the faculty member, when does your personal statement start? And the bad advice she got was your personal statement starts the day you start medical school. Now, interestingly enough, this applicant had two things that profoundly differentiated her, and one of them started as early as age 7. So I think that, I would say as far as an accomplishment, probably high school, if it really was merit. But I think that the important thing is, as Marissa was saying, it's really more, it doesn't, like say, it doesn't make any difference whether it's being an artist or being an athlete. It's just, it shows, your stick-to-itiveness. You can, go out there and do it year after year after year, because that's what medicine is. I mean, we all know that, a buzzword that's been a buzzword for the past probably decade has been lifelong learning. We've all got to do MOC. We've all got to keep learning. We may go do a case tomorrow that we've never seen before. So I think if it shows character attributes that we collectively see as admirable in an applicant, great. If it doesn't really add to that in any way, shape, or form, and it's just fluffing up your CV or your personal statement, then I would say no.
Okay. So stories intended to create empathy. Marissa, I'll throw this one to you.
So I guess similar theme here. Again, it depends. So it depends on what it is and how you tell the story. If it's, and this could be, an example of like a medical condition or something as well, which we already sort of touched on, or it could be something else. Depending on how that story is told, it could, if it invokes sort of empathy only, then I think it's bad, and that's not something that we want to read or that you should be putting out there. But if it is something that perhaps along the way really shows your grit and your, as Tony said, stick-to-itiveness, or whatever it is, whatever that story is, and perhaps it might be a little bit of a story where somebody might go, wow, that this person has been through a lot. I feel a little bit bad for them, but look at where they are now. That's amazing. Then I think it can be actually very powerful. So, for example, we've all interviewed applicants over the years that, came to this country maybe as a refugee, or, certain things like that, which if the story is told in such a way that it's simply trying to create empathy, then that isn't necessarily as powerful. But if it's told in such a way that it really leads the reader, leads us to really see how far you've come and the attributes that you've acquired because of it, then that's the story to tell.
Deborah?
Yeah, I agree with what Marissa said, that that what we look for in applicants, and the personal statement as part of your larger application, is not necessarily the best applicant, but we're looking for the right applicant for our program. And the only way that we can tell if somebody is the right applicant for our program is by knowing who they are as a person and what sort of personal strengths they have. So stories that just tell me something about you that you had nothing to do with, that sort of happened to you, don't help me understand if you'll be a right fit. What helps me understand if you'll be a right fit is if you tell me that story and then tell me the attributes that you developed from it that will make you a hard worker, a good resident, a great student.
Great. My last one is that you were born to be a plastic surgeon. Tony, what are your thoughts when you read that I've known I wanted to be a plastic surgeon since I was, very young?
Well, I would say of the 11 that you picked, some of them didn't really bother me very much, but this bothers me a lot. Because, I mean, I think that I think Marissa, she mentioned about attributes, And I think, to me, one of my biases is that something that I don't want is I don't want someone who's naive. And I think if you write this in your personal statement, you're naive. And I'm sorry. Next applicant.
Michael, thoughts?
I agree with everything that Tony just said. I don't think I can even add any more. If I see something like this in the personal statement, it just seems very fake and contrived, and I'll just move on to the next person.
I'm glad we've got one that we agree on. I think that's, I think, Tony, the comment you made actually to start this, I think, is impressive. I mean, I picked a bunch of topics here that I think are common themes, and I think we've kind of shown that they're not bad, but they can have various impacts depending on how those themes are addressed, and that readers can have different, feelings to them. And outside of potentially this one, and I guess I didn't get consensus because I didn't ask Deborah and Marissa if they had a problem with statement, but I think this just shows the importance of understanding a broad audience that you're presenting to, and how everyone's going to react a little bit differently, and to just keep in that context the story that you're trying to tell. I'm just going to give a couple other tips, and I know, Tony, you had some stuff I think you wanted to share as well. Although this is not directly related to the personal statement, we don't really have a spot in any of the upcoming webinars to talk about this. So since it often goes with your personal statement, please get a professional headshot for your applications. Your medical school will do them. I think about typically when I have visiting student applications, about a third of the students get emails back from me suggesting that they have a photo taken that doesn't, involve the dog in the background, or it's not the picture from your wedding in your tux or anything like that. So please get a professional headshot. Your med school will do that for you. Make sure you respond to all of your emails. We are a small family, and so we all do talk, and then. And obviously this is interestingly relevant with the events that happened with the Journal of Vascular Surgery recently. And my point is not the point at all that those authors were trying to make. But I think you just need to be mindful of your social media presence, and if that's what you want to convey to others. I have no problems with whatever you want to post or express. Just make sure that that's what you want others to read, and think about what's out there. And then just remember there's some randomness. So Tony, I think you said you had some other stuff you want to talk about, so I'm happy to hand over the screen to you, or the lead here. Is that fair? Yep, you're on mute still.
So I just have a couple of comments, and actually I thought, Jeff, you actually really had a great lead in to this statement that I'm going to make. And you said a personal statement isn't personal, and it isn't a statement. But the one thing it's a story. It's a short story. And so I actually I used to tell, and I've helped a lot of people over the years, and there's actually a literary term that ties up the ending of a story, which is, my French is probably poor, it's denouement, right? It's the last part of the story. It ties everything together. And so to me, the one thing that I used to say to people when I was coaching them to write a personal statement, how did you want the personal statement to the end? What did you want the effect on the reader? And I used to say that you wanted the effect on the reader is, I have to meet this applicant. So I think that, if what you have to do is, if this is your 1 or 2 page short story, then you have to be very careful that everything that you put in this story, the story of your life, regardless of where it starts, is that it contributes to that. That if it doesn't contribute to Jeff Kozlow in Ann Arbor saying, I want to meet this applicant, then it's extraneous. So I think that, and I admire Hemingway, not just his writing style, I admire everything he ever did. But make it short, declarative sentences that people can get through, that they're not just wandering all over the place. And if you get to the point and people read that and they come away with the same conclusion, I need to meet this applicant, then I think that you've done a good job with your personal statement.
Just until you say that, and I will tell you, one of the things that I do when I review personal statements, in addition to, I often have one of the residents look at it as well, is I ask for what are the 2 or 3 quick things or impressions that you get at the end of it. It's exactly what you're talking about, and I give that back to the students and ask them, is this what you're trying to convey? Because this is what I read. And I think it's valuable to have other opinions. And I think that when you're having other people read your personal statement, that's a valid question to ask them. You know, is what are the 2 or 3 things? What are the 2 or 3 adjectives that came to your mind after reading this about me? And if that's what you're trying to express, if you've met your goal. So I completely agree with you on that. Marissa, thoughts?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I sort of feel badly because we went through all these things that we don't want them to do. And then at the end, we sort of said, oh, but at the end, we should all really want to meet you. I think that's sort of a lot of pressure now. I mean, I would say if you have a really compelling story to tell, as I've mentioned a couple times, that shows us grit, etc., then tell the story. However, if you don't, that's okay. If you're a strong student, you're hardworking, you have all these great attributes about you, and your application is really good, then at the end of the personal statement, we should just make sure that we don't say to ourselves, ooh, I don't want to meet this person. Because as Jeff mentioned early on, the personal statement rarely gets you the interview, but it sometimes can get you to not get the interview if it is a little bit extraneous. So if you have a great story to tell it. But if you don't feel like you need to make something up or make it this spectacular piece of literature if it's not genuine. You know, at the end of the day, it should be, then in that case, it should just be fairly benign so that when readers read it, they don't think that you're crazy.
I think the other point is that don't put a slide that says be positive as your highlight and then go through 11 things that you may want to reconsider. I'll have to do this a little differently next year. Michael, what are your thoughts? Any final thoughts before we see if there's any questions in the chat room?
Oh, I'd actually like to hear what you guys have to say about this. For me, the personal statement, and I agree with what Marissa just said, it's not going to get you the interview. And honestly, a lot of times I don't even look at the personal statement until I've either gotten to the point, either I'm going to interview them because of other things on their application, or I'm not going to interview them because of other things on their application. But if you get into that gray area where you need some sort of differentiator to move them one way or the other, then I'll read the personal statement. But a lot of times I won't even read it until I've already accepted them for an interview, and then I just want to use it to know more about the applicant. One of the things I see this on the chat, there's a few people asking about the length. One thing that the applicants have to realize is we are going through 250 plus applications a year. And so when people write very long personal statements, and those are some of the things that Jeff, you did talk about, that can make it, that are very verbose, it can make it long, it's going to lose our interest very quickly. And so I think that any personal statement, you have to get them right off the bat with something that is going to want the reader to continue to read about the applicant and make them want to interview.
Yeah, any other thoughts on length from any of the panelists?
I think it has to be less than a page. And I would say 3/4 of a page is better because, as Michael mentioned, it's a lot to get through these. And in general, this is not, the strongest or the most important part of your application.
There's a question here, Deborah, I'll throw this one to you. Is there ever a time that a personal story would be okay to include in the personal statement?
Yes, I think that personal stories can be very useful tools depending on how they're used. And remember that the key is that we need to be able to get a sense from the personal statement of what kind of resident you're going to be. And so if you make a personal statement and if you use a personal story and don't make that leap. People will impose their own leap, and you may not like their assumptions when they do about your story. So when you use a story, and I actually, when I edit, I like something unique about the person, so that I can actually come up with an adjective, oh, this is the rugby player, or this is the chef, that allows me to kind of conjure up an image of what that person. But what I really need to know is, what is it that experience gave you that will make you be a good resident? So I will be working in a restaurant, taught me how to manage multiple unhappy people at the same time while still, delivering. So you want to make that leap with the personal story about what the attributes are that are going to make you a good fit for a program.
So Tony, there's a question here I'm going to throw your way first, and it's kind of asked in two formats, but I think it's this similar question. So some students, it's being recommended that they actually write multiple personal statements, either for individual programs, picking the top 5, 10 that they're interested in, or potentially writing a different personal statement for research heavy program versus a clinical program versus a mixed program, big city versus small city. What are your thoughts on writing multiple personal statements to try to tailor towards programs? And I'll say this is new to me because I don't think this was an option at least a couple of years ago to have different personal statements. So this may be a newer thing, at least in my experience. But what are your thoughts?
I guess what I would probably say is I agree with you in that it's very new. I think that the one thing that I can tell you that, again, it has some risk. I mean, I've had people that have made their personal statement so that it was just for one program. This was for fellowships, and then it got sent to the wrong program. So I would probably say, to me, it's all about, risk reward. It strikes me that that's pretty high risk. I mean, I guess it's high reward if it gets you in the program you want. But I think if you tailor it for specific programs, it may not work. So I'd probably say no.
Marissa, I saw you shaking your head a little bit. I'm not sure if it's because you made a wrong turn or you had a thought on it.
I hope not. I hope I don't get lost. I haven't heard of that either. So either it's new or I'm super naive and I just haven't realized I've seen it. I don't like it. I think, to me, the first thing it conjures up is it's a little bit disingenuous, because if you're writing your personal statement and in your personal statement you're talking about Washington University and how you just have always wanted to train with me or with, Dr. McKinnon or whatever it is, then, I know you're not only applying to one program, so I know you're saying the exact same thing to how many other programs. So to me, it's almost like there's going to be this air of it not being very genuine right off the bat. So I don't really like that piece of it. I would suggest instead, if you really do have a couple of top programs, that's where I think the concept of, as Jeff mentioned earlier, that plastic surgery is really small and we all talk, comes in. And that's where you can try to rely a little bit on your mentors and have them help you get the word to kind of their friends at other programs, on programs that you are very, very interested in. Obviously, this is a bad year in terms of not being able to, come visit programs and express your interest in that way, by spending time with the program. And so it makes it a little bit harder from that regard. But I think the nice thing about this year is that so many of us are doing all of these things virtually, that you can express your interest in a program in that way and show up to some of the conferences, show up to some of the journal clubs, different things that you may be invited to at some of the different programs, and express your interest in that way rather than a tailored personal statement.
I just want to add, going back to the fact that everybody talks, that's a way that tailored personal statements can backfire. That if if you tailor a personal statement to one program and then that program talks to another program that then says, oh, you know what? We thought she would be great, but obviously she just really only wants to do clinical work, and they're referring their personal statement, it could end up creating confusion and then having people trust you a little less, like Marissa was saying. So I think that in addition to just sounding like a tremendous amount of work to write 15 personal statements, I think that it can backfire. It could backfire in a lot of other ways that you may not have realized.
And just to tack on to that, I think the other question was, should you have two personal statements, one that's geared more towards a research, more admin, one that's geared more towards a community program? I also would say that I understand that it's stressful and it's a competitive match, and it's very important that you match at a good place for you. So if you want to be in an academic program with a lot of academics and strong research bent to it, then that's where you should be applying, and that's where you should be directing your efforts. And if you don't want that and you want to be more in a community program, then the opposite is true as well. Because if you want one flavor of program and you wind up in another that's completely opposite, that's 6 years is a long time for you and for the program. And so I would say, your application and your personal statement should really reflect you and not what you think the program is looking for.
I'm just quickly looking through kind of the questions here to see if there's anything. This is a question, it's not really personal statement oriented, but it's related. What about including experiences prior to med school in the ERAS application, such as medical mission trips, volunteering in undergrad, et cetera? Is this frowned upon? Go ahead, Tony.
I would say no. I mean, I may be naive, but I think that plastic surgeons tend to be altruistic more than many other, specialists in medicine. So I think that, many of us do, really mission work and underserved and all that sort of thing. So I would say that at least if you applied to our place and you had done some mission work, if you had participated in global surgery, if you had, in med school, done something at like a St. Vincent de Paul or something like that clinic, we would look upon it favorably.
Yeah, I do think you have to and I think this is kind of the point others have made, that if there are one-day experiences in high school, then they probably don't belong. But if they were real experiences that impacted you, then they probably do. I mean, they definitely have to be more impactful the farther back that they go, compared to med school, where you probably are including the different interest groups and stuff that you were in. So I think it's a little bit of judgment. I do want to end in the next 8 minutes, just to be respectful of everyone's time. But there's two other quick questions here. Michael, this one's for you. Should I rely more on my letter of recs to discuss my observed qualities rather than narrating my work ethic on rotations, et cetera?
I would say yes. I think Marissa brought it up earlier and I know Deborah and everyone's really talked about this. It's such a small community in plastic surgery that if you can get your mentor or whoever's writing your letters of recommendation to express those in the letter, I think that goes a lot further than you trying to explain it in the personal statement. Because it could have, all those pitfalls that we all talked about earlier. Even the overconfidence portion could really come into play. And so if there's certain attributes that you need to be highlighted, I think just, working with the people and showing the work ethic on a daily basis, the people that are writing will express that for you.
Marissa, here, this is a little bit related, but how do you talk about an accomplishment that you're proud of without sounding arrogant or overconfident?
Yeah, that's hard. As you mentioned before, writing about yourself is really hard. I think that, I guess I would approach it from the perspective of, I think somebody mentioned this as well, when your reader is finished reading it, what is it that you hope that they know about you? And instead of that, instead of them knowing about you that like you got some big award or whatever it is, what think about it from the perspective of what you want them to know about you is an element about you, what you care about, your grit, your tenacity, your ability to work with other people, et cetera, et cetera. Whatever the reason for the story is, use that, not just simply like, oh, I'm really good at X and I really want to make sure they know about it. Well, why do you care if we know about that? What are the qualities that are that go into you being so good at that? Let's focus on your qualities rather than just talking about how good you are at something.
Deborah, there's a question here, and I think you sort of sent an answer out to the group, but I don't know if they all saw the question. So, thoughts on writing about how a unique hobby relates to our personality or mental framework?
Yeah, the theme is really that you can use the personal stories and you can use your hobbies and your personal experiences. We do want to hear about them, but they need to be in the service of speaking to your character, to your core qualities that will make you a great resident. So how a unique hobby relates to somebody's personality is exactly the type of story that I want to read. Not that you have the unique hobby, because that doesn't really mean much, but how that unique hobby relates to you is exactly what we're looking for. And again, I mentioned it before, but really just make the leap for people. When you talk about a hobby or an experience, make the leap of how it influenced who you are as a person. So like what Marissa was saying, I couldn't say it better, that think about why you want us to know this story. What is it that you want me to get out of it? And don't rely on me to make the assumptions that you want me to make.
Tony, here's a question, and I think it's a really good one. But regarding personal or medical stories and being positive. So if an applicant experiences something that might be perceived as difficult or even negative, such as depression, as the example given in the question here, but came out having a strong attribute, will you consider it a great story, or do you focus too much that this person went through the negative event?
So one of the people that I've interviewed with, because we've interviewed two people in a room, I've interviewed with him for years, and he asked to the applicant, what's the hardest thing that you've ever been through? What's the hardest difficulty you ever overcame? And frequently that almost sets the tone for how we look at the character of the individual. So, I think like the cliche, it's not what happens to us in life, it's what we do about it. So I think that it's okay to show weakness, it's okay to show vulnerability, but at the same point in time, I think Marissa's been talking about grit. I think if you unfortunately got involved with substance when you were young, but you overcame that, and that was a long time ago, and you demonstrated grit and focus, and then I think in that regard, it's okay to show that vulnerability. I do think that, on the other hand, because you had the one slide with empathy, I think if you bring it up and you expect people are going to give you a residency spot because they feel sorry for you, that will never happen. Because I think that, to me, one of the sort of the best thing that ever came back to me, and it stuck with me for years, was when someone said, this is a no-risk applicant. So no program director wants to accept the risk of having somebody that's going to relapse because of substance or something like that. On the other hand, if somebody can show that they have moved through it and they're a no-risk applicant, then I think it's an entirely different thing.
Are there other thoughts?
I don't know that I really answered the question.
Other thoughts from the other panelists? This is a unique topic here. No, I think, Tony, I agree with you. I think it's how, if it's something that's a negative, and in this case, the questioner used depression. I don't necessarily think depression's a negative, but it's out there, and there's obviously stigma on our side, and there's lots of other things that happen to people across the board. I think it's okay. I think you do have to then feel comfortable making that your story, though. And that's where I think it's trickier, because people are going to turn to your personal statement and they're going to ask about that. And I think that's the thing to consider, is how you're going to tell that story. And if it is a strong attribute in the end, I think that's very reflective. I just think you need to make sure that you're comfortable telling that story in its details, because people are going to ask you about it then. There's going to be a lot of people, I think, that are very responsive to those that use that as some change in event and whatever that thing was prior. So those are just kind of my thoughts. I don't know if Deborah, Michael, Marissa, if I gave you any more time to put thoughts together on that with.
No, I think you said it really well. I was kind of going to say the same thing about it being your story. I think, again, just similar to a lot of the other things we've talked about tonight, I don't think that topic is off limits, but it has to really make sense, and it has to be, you really need it to illustrate a strong point about you as an individual. It can't just be like a weak, you used the example of somebody who went through depression and came out on the other end. It needs to be more than that. Otherwise, I think, similar to a lot of the other things we've talked about, it's just not going to be as meaningful, more than it's risky. I think it's just simply not going to be as meaningful. So you really have to turn it into really focusing on the positive, and not just simply that you're better now. It has to be more about, what have you done with that? What are you doing with your energy? How have you made a positive impact on those around you, et cetera, et cetera. So if it's part of the larger story to illustrate that point, I think it's okay.
Great. Well, it's 9:15, so I appreciate everybody's and all the panelists sharing their experience and thoughts. To the students, I hope you found it helpful. Please reach out if there's questions. I hope that you're around next week. We do have another webinar to be focused on kind of how to best hold your own web meetings and virtual meetings. How to present yourself virtually in that context, and to get the most out of a 20-minute Zoom meeting that you have with any of the people that you're contacting with. So hopefully you'll be there for that if that's an interesting topic. And again, please let us know. Reach out to us if there's other topics or things that ACAPS can do to help through this process, or provide to you. Please let us know so that we can make sure we continue to roll that into all the efforts that are being made by a large number of faculty across the country to try to guide the whole process during this still uncertain time. So with that, thanks everybody. I hope you have a good evening.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.